Hello, my name is Jonathan Haslam and welcome to this webinar. I'm a UK-based communications strategist and political and business commentator. And on behalf of Stanford University Press, we're honoured to have with us today our distinguished authors, Arnoud Meyer and Peter Williamson, to discuss their new book, Ecosystem Edge, Sustaining Competitiveness in the Face of Disruption, which has just been published and is available for order now. And as you can see, is a truly splendid volume. And that's aside from its contents, which are quite marvellous. Let me just explain a little bit about how we want to run the webinar. And I will introduce the topic and Arnoud and Peter to you. And to start off, I'll put a few questions to them. And while that's going on, we all hope you will be inspired to start asking your questions via the Q&A box at the foot of your screen. I'll do my best then to put them to our experts with some assistance from behind the scenes. And we'll do this on a number of occasions and again towards the end. Anyway, without any more ado, let's get started by setting the scene. New technologies, rapidly changing customer needs, and challenger competitors are disrupting standard business models. This book explains why building and leading a dynamic ecosystem of partners that reinforce, strengthen, and help a company to innovate is now an important way to meet these challenges. This book offers a strategy to accomplish this through current cases, clear tools, and specific takeaways to convert ideas into action. Our authors. Arnoud Meyer is University Professor at the Lee Kong Chian School of Business at Singapore Management University, and for him right now it's the afternoon. He is the co-author of Process Theory, The Principles of Operations Management and Global Future, The Next Challenge of Asian Business. Peter J. Williamson is Professor of International Management at the University of Cambridge, Judge Business School, and is Fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge. He is the co-author of The Competitive Advantage of Emerging Country Multinationals and Dragons at Your Door, How Chinese Cost Innovation is Disrupting the Rules of Global Competition. Gentlemen, good morning and welcome. And let's get stuck in the first instance to the origin of the book. Now, it is quite fantastic. When you read the first paragraph, the first chapter rather, I look at it and I see the name Tesla mentioned. And I'll just again go to my iPad here if I can do and point out to people one of the main stories on the Financial Times. You talked, both of you then, about Tesla just overcoming Ford and General Motors as the most valuable car companies in the US. And only today, as we see in the Financial Times, Tesla has now overtaken Toyota as the top car company by value in the world. So you're looking at all of this. Could you just explain what were you seeing taking place in more detail? Perhaps Peter, could you lead us off?
Yes, Jonathan, thank you. Well, when we started looking at companies around Cambridge, we noticed they didn't seem to be doing innovation just using the capabilities and resources inside their company, but it seemed to be happening using a network of partners and even sometimes competitors, more like a kind of biological ecosystem. So we're intrigued with that and how innovation through these ecosystems was happening. So we start to talk to executives about that, and whether we're in Cambridge or Singapore or China or Germany, the executives responded well to this. But the interesting thing is they said, we think we're already doing some of this, but what we'd like you to do is help us approach it in a more systematic way. So that's how we started the long journey to understand how business leaders could develop an ecosystem around their company to make it more successful and to enable innovation and greater agility. So the book really is about how to do that rather than why you should do it, which obviously is part of our argument, but we focused a lot on the how managers and executives should approach this.
Thank you very much, Peter. Arnoud, could I just invite you to perhaps tell us in a little bit more detail then about the process you and Peter go through once you've established this idea, this notion, and the challenge is thrown to you by the business people Peter has just mentioned in Cambridge in his case, about bringing that systematic force to bear, to give them the tools. Over to you.
Yeah, in a sense, what Peter just described started sort of around 2008, when we both were working in Cambridge. I moved then later on to Singapore, but over a glass of Chardonnay wine in one of the pubs of Cambridge, we were sort of sharing with each other our experiences. Peter with the case of ARM, the risk processor company, the design company. I had sort of looked at the Cambridge entrepreneurial network, and we actually both saw that they were working in an ecosystem, the word that we now use. Perhaps we didn't use the word ecosystem at that moment, we still used probably a network, but where perhaps the key was that even the lead company in that network didn't fully control and direct the ecosystem. They sort of could catalyze it, they could nudge it, and could lead it. And we were sort of intrigued in how you actually create an organization which is a bit of a hybrid of a market and a hierarchical organization. How do you manage such an organization? And so we looked at a few case studies, among others also Dassault Systèmes, a French software company that makes product lifecycle management systems. And it led us to formulate 6 keys to unlock the ecosystem advantage. And they were like pinpointing the value added to the partners in the ecosystem, structuring different partner roles, stimulating complementary investments by the ecosystem partners, reducing the transaction costs, because in a network like that there are transaction costs, enabling and steering the co-learning among the partners, and finally also engineering the value capture mechanisms. And we published that in a paper in 2012 in California Management Review. But as Peter pointed out, early on we had to explain the concept of ecosystems and convince executives that it could be useful for them. But sort of from 2014, 2015 onwards, they actually told us that they were convinced of the value, but didn't really know how to develop and grow these ecosystems. And yeah, that's the genesis of this book.
Thank you very much, Arnoud. I wonder, could I just put to you one supplementary point here, which is how do companies find these ecosystem partners? Is it as natural as we need X, to use a British phrase, a widget? Who does the widget? Or is it a different process? Would you perhaps like to introduce that one, and maybe Peter could comment as well?
Yeah. In our executive education, I often ask the question, are you already working in an ecosystem? And frankly speaking, in almost 100% of the cases, the participants, the executives will say, yes, we know there are ecosystems around us. Perhaps we haven't really managed them. And often I do an exercise and say, can you actually draw your ecosystem, make a picture out of it? But there's one condition that I always put there, and I've learned it actually from Peter, but that is never make it a hub and spoke diagram. So an ecosystem is definitely not you in the middle and everybody reporting to you. That's probably a lot more of a control and managed and controlled system. But create a pattern, create a drawing of what your ecosystem is, and then ask yourself the question, who is leading it? And could I be the leader? Peter?
Peter, an observation.
Yes, well, one of the key things that we see, and Arnoud mentioned this, is bringing together companies with different capabilities and knowledge to help you speed up and create innovation. And in the COVID crisis, Germany's president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, I think summed it up very well when he was talking about the virus. And he said, no single entity covers the medical, economic and political elements required to produce a vaccine for all. And I think the same holds true whether you're trying to keep your supply chain moving or innovating or pivoting the business to online sales or developing a new business model. So it's about attracting a set of partners that bring diverse skills and knowledge to help you speed up your innovation. And they might be in related industries. So they might not be just your customers, suppliers, but they might be your customers' customers. They might be people in other industries. So to give an example of that, imagine what it takes for a car company to move from cars to mobility solutions. It's absolutely impossible to do that on your own. So if you think about the capabilities you need to kind of restructure the business model, they're very diverse, and therefore you're going to need a diverse set of partners. Now, Jonathan, you asked, how do you find those partners? And we found there are two ways. One is that you can create a sort of honeypot to attract them. It might be a platform, it might be a pool of knowledge that they can share, or you can go out to target a partner you think has the capabilities that you need. But as Arnoud mentioned, the important thing is it's not a hub and spoke control system. You're not creating a supply chain. You're trying to get a network around you that's flexible and where people can learn together what this innovation looks like.
Thank you very much indeed. And I've got one question coming up, and I'll turn to that in a few moments. I'd like to cover a little bit more of the base of the book, if I may. And could I just encourage everybody who's watching, please do put forward your questions. We will do our very best to get our distinguished authors to answer them. And I'd like to move on to a slightly different aspect at the moment. And this is where we've actually got to in a sense. It's about working an ecosystem in today's environment. I mean, heaven knows this could not be a more timely publication. We're suffering a global pandemic. Disruption is absolutely at its core. We see the way in which different countries are dealing with it. Even today, we're hearing very dark warnings from the United States about the way in which their response has been implemented and the disruption to the economy, the change that they're seeing, while a stock exchange is still going great guns. So disruption is the environment for many industries. Before the pandemic, technology, but it's taken on a new meaning in 2020. This COVID impact on supply chains, access to customers, and the issues of workforce and talent availability, they look like tough questions to answer, but there might also be opportunities. So could I ask perhaps Arnoud to kick off with this one? Yeah. How can ecosystem strategy both deal with disruption and help companies grasp new opportunities in a crisis environment?
What this crisis environment does is not necessarily completely disrupt what you're doing. And there are some industries, like obviously the airline industry, that is completely disrupted. But in many other industries, the current crisis is actually accelerating existing trends. I recently was talking to a law firm here in Singapore, and they basically were sharing with me that because now everybody is working from home, that they actually did are going to do in 6 months the automation of the back office, something they had planned to do, which was in the works, but actually was normally going to take 5 years. So the crisis, in my opinion, will accelerate very strongly a number of pre-existing trends. And therefore, companies need to be able to respond very quickly. They need to find innovative solutions. And perhaps what is the most important is that not only having the solution, but also being able to scale them up as fast as possible. A vertically integrated firm or an existing supply chain has difficulties in coping with such demands. But an ecosystem, that sort of very flexible network of partners that can co-evolve and align their investments, that ecosystem, that network that has the flexibility to react very quickly. Another example, I was talking to a few medical doctors here in Singapore, and they were pointing out that they had very quickly implemented telemedicine. Obviously, when you are here in Singapore, you wouldn't do necessarily telemedicine because your doctor is 500 meters away from here, such a small place. But because of COVID-19 and the lockdown that we had, telemedicine has been developed very quickly. That's a trend that will not go away. And actually, these medical doctors were thinking this offers us an opportunity to offer medical treatment, not only in Singapore, but in the surrounding countries. But then when they start thinking about it, and they want to do that very quickly, they realize that there are a number of issues that they have to overcome. Obviously, good tools for diagnosis, good drug delivery systems for the prescriptions that they write. But very interesting, they need to have actually a very good legal advice, because their legal liability in Singapore is going to be very different from what it would be in Thailand, or what it would be in Indonesia, or what it would be in Japan. In other words, they need to have to bring partners together, as Peter pointed out, not necessarily from the same industry, but from different industries, to quickly scale up that telemedicine. A traditional supply chain couldn't do that. Ecosystems have the flexibility to do it.
Thank you. Peter, would you like to put your perspective on that one as well, please?
Yes, certainly. Well, Arnoud mentioned speed a number of times and accelerating things. And I think when you're faced with disruption, as we've seen, speed is critical. And companies used to think about being first to market. But what we found is that the winners are increasingly those the first to scale it up. So speed to scale. And so the benefits of that scale are not only inside your company, it's actually the scale of your total ecosystem. So in a way, you're probably going to find yourself increasingly, in responding to the disruption, competing with other ecosystems. So thinking about how to get to scale quickly and how to help grow the scale of your total ecosystems, very important. The other thing we've found, and I'm sure many of our listeners will know this, is that the old planning systems that were based on extrapolation simply don't work in this disrupted environment. And in the book, we talk about what Thomson Reuters did, now the Refinitiv company, when it found that its extrapolation systems didn't work. So in the agricultural commodity area, what they did is they put a simple app in the hands of farmers to upload their data about acreage planted and the conditions of their crops. In exchange, they gave the farmers aggregate information, but they took that information that they gathered from all the farmers about their crop status and used it to forecast the crop volumes and prices. And then they sold that through their platform as a new suite of services. So finding ways to actually say, look, the previous planning, the previous business models that were based on forecasting the future are not going to work. How do I come up with new business models? And what kind of partners do I need to bring into my ecosystem so that those new business models can happen?
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. I'd just like to move on and I've got 3 questions up, which I shall turn to when we've, I think, covered the basics. So just let me ask one more question of Peter and Arnoud. And we're talking about ecosystem strategy in the face of disruption. And what does the past tell us? And actually, just struck by what you were saying, Arnoud, a moment ago about the telemedicine environment. You mentioned that in Singapore, there'd been quite a dramatic change in telemedicine in a very short space of time. But one of the things that the West is lauding places like Singapore about is the preparedness. And they went through a great deal with the SARS epidemic. And it made me wonder, actually, why telemedicine had not advanced even quicker. Is it the nature of technology? Is it the nature of this particular pandemic? And perhaps you can comment on that in the answer. But we are looking at changing landscapes in business. It's not just a question of emerging from competition or a new form of technology necessarily, but the landscapes do demand seemingly radical transformation. Let's go back to just mention Tesla as a name. So could you tell us, Peter, in the first instance, what companies are you seeing are harnessing these ecosystems to develop and to deal with disruption, and how?
Well, as I mentioned, the key thing that you need when you need to come up with a radical new business model is new knowledge and new capabilities that are going to help you deliver a broader range of things. I mentioned moving from cars to mobility systems. That was an obvious example of where you need a hugely expanded base of capabilities to make this work. And we often, think of these ecosystems as being in the kind of digital world and so forth. It's interesting you mentioned Tesla. It's a very traditional industry where this kind of thinking can help. And so one of the key cases we have in the book is advanced risk machines, ARM. Arnoud mentioned this, but you probably know that it was sold to SoftBank for $32 billion in 2016. It only had 4,000 employees, and it succeeded in this disruption by bringing a whole set of partners together. Some it works very closely with, and interestingly, some of those, like Samsung, are not ARM's customers. So ARM sells to semiconductor fabricators like Taiwan Semiconductor, but it actually needs in its ecosystem people like Samsung, and it keeps a person 100% of their time inside Samsung to actually access the knowledge and capabilities of where Samsung is going with the products, so that it can feed that into its chip designs. So dealing with disruption is about coming up with a new business model, and to do that, we've got to look much further than just our customers and suppliers as to who has the knowledge and capabilities to make that new business model work.
Arnoud, an observation.
Yes. Your question about telemedicine and why didn't we do it earlier here in Singapore is an interesting one. It is true what you just said, that Singapore and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Korea had learned from previous crises. Here we had SARS, and in Hong Kong the same. In South Korea they had MERS in 2009. And so we've sort of analyzed, or the powers that be have analyzed what needed to be done in case of a crisis like this. Why didn't telemedicine exist yet before we had this particular crisis? Probably because we've never had actually a lockdown. Even under SARS or MERS, there were strict controls, there were people were followed up when they were ill, etc., but there were no lockdowns. And that was a new element. The other thing that is interesting here for Singapore, and then leads me again to ecosystems, is that Singapore had a perfect plan of what to do in case there was a pandemic. They had actually not counted on one thing, because all previous pandemics, like SARS or MERS, the people that were actually contagious, that could infect other people, always had fever. So you could select them out by just measuring temperature. So the first thing that Singapore did in answer to your question was actually start measuring temperature everywhere. They hadn't counted on the fact that in this particular case, persons could be infectious even if they were asymptomatic or had no fever whatsoever. So there was this hesitation early March here in Singapore about, hey, this is not at all what we expected. And that's where, again, the value of an ecosystem comes. Because if it would be a pure traditional supply chain, we probably would not have been able to react very quickly. We've seen that, by the way, in other countries where the reaction was a lot slower. But because we had a close and dense collaborative ecosystem here in Singapore, the government, in collaboration with the universities, with the experts, and with a number of other people, could redefine very quickly, redeploy resources to actually react to what was actually unpredicted. The flexibility of ecosystems are very important, I believe.
Thank you very much. And just as an add-on to that, I wonder if you would, either Peter or Arnoud, just like to comment on the search for a vaccine, where it would appear that the scientific community has shared in a way which has been quite remarkable, maybe unique in its first instance. Do you have a point of view about that and that ecosystem?
Yeah, well, that's definitely the case. And what I think is very clear in the vaccine example is that it's not just a matter of coming up with a vaccine. You need to do the clinical tests, and to take the one that's being developed in Oxford, they're now doing the clinical tests in Brazil because there are more cases there to work on. So going beyond their immediate partners in the UK, and then of course to scale it up and distribute it, you need to have another set of partners. So they've partnered with the major vaccine manufacturers around the world to start building the manufacturing capacity to produce the stuff at scale. And they're also working with the health systems of different countries to make sure that we have a distribution system that can actually give this vaccine to people. And most of it probably is not going to be oral, so it's quite an issue to actually inject people with the vaccine. So there's a whole series of partnerships, and it's very clear that it's not just coming up with the product. To actually scale it up quickly and build a business model that's going to work, you need a diversity of different partners and different skills. And they might be anywhere in the world. So it's not just a local cluster, if you like. I mentioned Oxford having to reach out to Brazil in order to do the clinical trials where there are more cases that they can use on this.
Thank you very much. Arnoud, I see you'd like to make a point. Please go ahead.
No, I would also say in the case of a vaccine that Peter just described, the resources that are needed to get this done are probably, it's impossible for a single company or even for a small group of companies to come up with the resources. And that's where also in the book, we describe the case of Alibaba, and this has nothing to do with vaccines, but with the online retail and the financial systems that Alibaba has developed for China, but where they were actually confronted with the fact that there was a huge market in rural China, away from the coastal provinces, but that in most of these cases, there were no connections to internet, that there were no people that actually had the ability to do the retail, there were no delivery systems. And you see how even a large company like Alibaba with very significant resources actually had to build an ecosystem in 2015 with local governments, with delivery systems companies, because they just don't have the resources to do it on their own. Ecosystems are about scaling up, but also about mobilizing resources that you perhaps cannot own. And that is, coming back to the vaccine case, probably why we need those ecosystems there too.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm now going to move to one or two questions. I think David Pickering might be interested because he's just mentioned Alibaba, but he wasn't first up. So I am going to go to a question from Michael Netsley, which is, how can startups and innovators think about building and leveraging an ecosystem? For example, if you are commercializing new research and bringing an innovation to market that is genuinely new, and the value might not be immediately understood. Peter, do you want to take that one on?
Yes, well, actually, it turns out that a number of the cases in our book are actually companies that started very small and they used the ecosystem to scale up. I mentioned Arm. Arm started in 1990 with just 12 engineers in a 14th century barn in Cambridge. And they illustrate something that's interesting about this, that you don't have to be the biggest company in your industry in order to lead the ecosystem. You can carve out a piece of the ecosystem where you're leading it. And in their case, it was the design of these RISC chips, the sort of boiler room in devices. They're in 95% of mobile phones in the world. And what they realized is that in order to get this moving, they needed to really understand the roadmaps of people like Samsung or today Huawei, at the time it was Nokia, where they were going. And so they had to go out and, rather than trying to perfect a product or an offering and present it to the customer, they used the ecosystem to actually improve that offering and learn how to make it suitable for the market. So when they started out with Nokia, Nokia's reaction was that your offering is absolutely terrible. It uses too much power. It's got too many lines of code in it. It's going to drain the battery too fast. And instead of just walking away in despair, they realized actually these people who are not our customer are the people that have the knowledge we need to be successful in scaling up our startup. So I think this whole idea, and Arnoud mentioned this a moment ago, is that, you know, when you're a scale up, when you're a startup, you don't have the resources. And so finding the right partners to bring those resources so you don't have to do everything yourself and try to learn difficult things from scratch, rather than using the established knowledge of someone else, is actually key to these ecosystems. So we feel that these ecosystems are very useful to startups. But one word of warning, you have to have a key component of the ecosystem. It might be your IP, it might be your knowledge, it might be your product, that the ecosystem needs to thrive. And that's what gives you leverage in the ecosystem to attract the partners to help you scale it up.
Thank you. Arnoud?
It is a very interesting question, and I will refer to another example that we describe in the book at length, and that is the French software company Dassault Systèmes, which is actually not that well known in the world because it's a very B2B company, but they make what they call product lifecycle management systems for the layman. That is basically computer-aided design, computer-aided manufacturing systems. If you know the name of Dassault from somewhere, you probably don't see them as a software company, but perhaps as a producer of military aircraft in France. So their origins are really in aircraft engineering and in automotive engineering. And sort of you would think that a small company that is producing this software on its own was not selling it on its own. All sales went originally through IBM, and that in itself was an interesting ecosystem. But they actually came to the conclusion that what they had, and I refer to what Peter say, you need to have something that you can actually monetize, and that in this particular case were the algorithms that deep down in the software allow you to simulate things. That could actually be used in many different industries. Fashion, pharmaceuticals, mining, but that actually they didn't know anything about these industries, and that their brands in these industries was not existing. So if you are a smaller company and you need actually to, as Michael was asking the question, sort of expose the industry to what your capabilities are, what they did was teaming up with the usually number 2 in the industry who wants to become number 1. In the case of fashion, it was Gucci. In the case of pharmaceuticals, it was Novartis. In the case of mining, it's BHP Billington. And they sort of teamed up with them to say, we know what the software is, you know the industry. Let's work together and let's try to create a sort of a demonstrator, in a sense, of what with this software can be done in terms of computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing. We go into details in this case in the book, but it's an interesting system whereby you build ecosystems to get to the knowledge that you sort of lack about industries, to get to the knowledge of what specialists in the industries know, and then how you can apply your algorithms to it.
Thank you very much indeed, Arnoud. Now, the audience questions are coming in, and what I'd like to do now is to put 2 of them, the first one to Peter and then the second to Arnoud. and then we'll go back a little bit into our script because there are other issues we'd like to touch upon. And I should say that we will, with the help of Rachel Shand behind the scenes and Charlotte Anderson, try to get you some sort of answer to your question if I'm not able to put it to our authors during the course of the webinar. So please do keep going on, even if I'm unable to get to you. So first of all, Peter, from Jim Johnson, what makes an ecosystem resilient? And conversely, what makes one fragile? And then for Arnoud, did you discern any common attributes among people who start ecosystems, such as influencing skills or powers of persuasion? Peter, over to you, please.
Yeah, well, I think very interesting question. Two things make it resilient. One is that it keeps on learning. So we found all the people in the ecosystem that were successful, they used the ecosystem to collect more knowledge, more information, which they then used to innovate. And so it's a matter of seeing the ecosystem as a living, breathing organism that needs to keep moving forward. And it's fed by the knowledge that's inside the ecosystem. So as an ecosystem leader, to keep it resilient, you need to think about the health of that ecosystem and using the knowledge that the ecosystem is generating to actually feed back to the ecosystem to make it work better and to keep it innovating and moving forward. But of course, you also probably need to keep some of that knowledge proprietary so that you have leverage over the ecosystem in order to monetize it and to take a profit out. But moving forward and making sure that you're getting a positive cycle going where the ecosystem's learning things and you're using that learning to help the ecosystem innovate. The second thing that makes an ecosystem resilient is to stop yourself, and most managers want to do this, try and command and control the ecosystem. You have to allow the ecosystem to flex itself. You have to encourage partners to work with each other without everything going through you as the central kind of controller. And that's quite difficult for managers that are used to commanding and controlling things. They find it risky, but you have to let go if you're going to have resilience, because one of the advantages of these ecosystems is their agility and flexibility. So they're the two things, keeping on learning and, excuse me, allowing the ecosystem to do some self-organization, not trying to command and control everything.
Right, and what about fragility? Any more to say about that, or is it covered in your first point?
Well, I think it's the other side of the coin of what I have what I have mentioned. So interesting. One of the things that Nokia tried to do when it was leading in the mobile phone business was create an ecosystem to develop the operating system, just as Android managed to do. And what happened is that because it tried to control this, the partners started falling out, and nobody else would join, and it lost all its dynamism, and therefore it fell to pieces. It basically became a division of Nokia. So this fragility actually paradoxically comes from trying to over control the ecosystem because it doesn't have enough flexibility to deal with changing circumstances.
Well, thank you. And I'm now going to turn, if I may, to Arnoud. Michael Jenkins is asking about common attributes among people who start ecosystems, such as influencing skills and powers of persuasion. And just picking up a point that Peter's made, an ecosystem, it seems to me as it's circular in a sense. One part of it may be running the ecosystem or have the ecosystem at hand and it works for them, but then a supplier has a different point of view, a perspective. And that is also resonant of what Peter has been talking about. And I wondered if you could just pick up on those different perspectives as well as the skills of some of the key people within ecosystems. Arnoud.
Thanks for the question. In our 9th chapter, we spent some pages on what we observed as commonalities among the leaders, the Jack Ma of this world, the Bernard Charles from Dassault Systèmes, and other people that were leading this ecosystem. And it struck us that at least 3 or 4 things are common to them. First of all, these people have to lead beyond their organization. They have to convince people that don't work for them, over whom they have no authority in a sense. So these people have to actually be very convincing and have to be able to sort of nudge people, lead people in a sense that are outside their organization. And why is that, or why can they do so? Probably because they have the credibility, both technical credibility, strategic credibility, but also very reliable people to work with. In other words, this sort of credibility that gives you soft power beyond your organization is the first characteristic. The second thing that we observed is that these are quite visionary people that actually can provide a vision not only for their company, but actually for the ecosystem as a whole. They can provide a roadmap. And obviously they will listen a lot. And maybe that's the third point that I wanted to say. These are people that actually have to listen very carefully to what's the information that is going around in the ecosystem. And very often you have to be very sensitive for soft, weak signals. There's a lot of tacit knowledge that probably floats around in an ecosystem. And you have to be able to pick up that soft, that tacit knowledge, that the weak signals that your partners are sending you. And that requires a strong listening capability. But with that listening capability, they actually can then provide, as I said, as my former point, the vision for the ecosystem as a whole. And then fourthly, obviously they have to be very relational. You need to build relationships, because what keeps an ecosystem together, and Peter has actually referred to it, it's the trust that exists between partners. It's not the contracts. One may write some contracts, but very often when I go back to our original observation of the ecosystem around Cambridge, the contracts were very limited, if there were contracts. It's often a handshake and being able to rely on each other. You need to build trust in the system. In a sense, the coordinating mechanism is not pricing what it is in a market, or it is not command and control and authority, what it is in a hierarchy. The coordinating mechanism in an ecosystem is trust. And that trust requires, and that was my fourth point, a lot of relationship building between the people in the ecosystem. So listening, credibility, providing vision, and building trust are 4 things that I would put up here as characteristics of ecosystem builders.
Thank you very much, Arnoud. And I want to just go back briefly before we go back to our script to Peter, because Peter, you were talking about resilience within ecosystems. And we're also interested in the issue of evolution. So in part, I think Arnoud's answered this question, but may I just throw it to you? It's a question from David Wong. Though there are clear advantages in a flexible ecosystem as opposed to a mature supply chain, might partners be less committed in relationships, less trustful, if, or given they know they're unlikely to be in it with you for the long haul? Peter.
Well, I think, as Arnoud said, trust is very important, but underlying this trust, I have to say in practical terms, it has to be of benefit to the partners to work in the ecosystem. So they're not doing it out of love and benevolence. They're doing it because they think they can make more profit by being part of your ecosystem. And therefore, part of the process of building that trust is to develop a strong value proposition for the partner. Why should the partner join my ecosystem? And so that's one of the things that holds it together. But coming more specifically, perhaps, to David's point, is that we don't say that ecosystems are the answer to every possible problem in business. I know that's a bit radical for people that write books, always like to say it's the silver bullet. But what we talk about toward the end of the book is this area of evolution. And ecosystems are very, very good where you're trying to discover a new value proposition and have a lot of innovation and learning and a lot of flexibility. Once the product offering or the service offering starts to stabilize and mature, so everybody knows what their roles are and what they contribute, you can move away from the ecosystem. In fact, you probably have to move away from the ecosystem to a more standard supply chain. Perhaps some companies in the ecosystem start to acquire each other. And that's because the transaction costs in an ecosystem, as Arnoud mentioned, are too high. There is a price for all this innovation and flexibility. But that doesn't mean that the partner is going to give up on you. It's just that the relationship changes. They become more of a contractor in the ecosystem. But interestingly, what we found is that good ecosystem leaders find new opportunities to create another innovative ecosystem around there. So Alibaba, for example, once its e-commerce business system started to become more stable and became more like a platform with buyers and suppliers, they created a whole new ecosystem based on the knowledge gained from e-commerce around fintech and using the data that they collected to do credit scoring and to work with lenders in the market. So you can actually keep on developing new ecosystems even as the old ones start to mature and move more toward a classic kind of supply chain. So it's making sure that there's always an upside and value proposition for the partners as you move forward.
Our audience is putting forward a lot of very interesting questions, and as I say, we'll try to find a way, if I don't draw them out, to get an answer to you. But I'd just like to pick up, both you and Arnoud have mentioned Alibaba, and I know that you've got an association in the past with Alibaba, Peter. And David Pickering's question is about the platform that Alibaba provided and enabling people to be successful on that platform, and comparing and contrasting it with some of the views about Amazon and its anti-competitive, anti-competitive activities, maybe undercutting merchants who are doing very well. He says, why can't Amazon resist undercutting? There's an opportunity for you to give us a point of view on that.
Well, I don't claim to be an expert on Amazon, but what I think is the problem is that they want to move back toward controlling everything. So it's two issues. One is the preference for control, which is very strong in Amazon, and it's in one of the things they're good at, in the sense that they created this wonderfully reliable system by very tight control, but it's negative if you apply that to the partners. So that's one aspect of, I think, why they find it difficult. The second thing is that Alibaba told me one of the main things they had to learn to lead an ecosystem was to stop doing things. And Amazon likes to do lots of things itself. You know, it develops new technology, for example, in the retailing with no checkouts and so on, all of itself. But what Alibaba discovered is that to really have an ecosystem where your partners are continuing to invest in it and continuing to be motivated, you can't move toward trying to do everything yourself. You have to learn what is your key role in the ecosystem and what should other people's roles be. And again, if you keep on taking away your partner's business, you're going to undermine the value proposition of them being part of the ecosystem and contributing it to. So I think Amazon's incredibly successful in running a platform, but its mentality in that business was not this, we have to narrow down the set of things we do and leave space for partners. Interestingly, in the book, we found that inside the Amazon group, the real ecosystem is Amazon Web Services, because in that business, they let the partners do all sorts of things in terms of software, in terms of migrating people onto the cloud, in terms of complementary technologies. And there, the partners are very, very committed, because Amazon stepped out of the way and just focused on building the best cloud platform for other partners and customers to work on. So I think that's the balance you have to keep in mind. And many of the traditional strengths of executives and management are actually antithetical to what you need to be able to do to be a successful ecosystem leader, which is to understand what you have to stop doing.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I hope, David, you found that helpful. And I think you may have been talking your own book a little bit there in asking that question of our great authors. So could I just move on to our script, because there's a little bit of extra ground I'd like to cover. And this is about traditional industries and small businesses, which are having a bit of a hard time at the moment. And I wonder, Arnaud, if you could comment on how you see ecosystems applying to traditional industries, or what strategies are working out there. And then perhaps, Peter, we might ask you to comment on smaller companies. Arnaud, over to you.
Yeah, first of all, I will start by reinforcing something that Peter said earlier on, that is that ecosystems are not a panacea for all situations. If efficiency is your biggest objective, it's probably not through an ecosystem that you're going to achieve it. In other words, when you look at traditional industries, the role of ecosystems is probably not in running the daily operations, but it's really in terms of when you have to innovate fast and scaling up, as we earlier said. In the book, we actually have the example of The Guardian, which was a relatively small, and still is a relatively small newspaper. And for my friends here that I see here in Asia, who may not know necessarily The Guardian, but it is a relatively small newspaper in the United Kingdom, or it was a small newspaper in the United Kingdom, with a very local appeal. Like virtually all newspapers in the world, they were disrupted very strongly by the online news sites or the online news feeds. But by building, and as Peter actually mentioned already before, a series of ecosystems first to bring a number of smaller publishers together to share the marketing and advertising capabilities and getting to know the customers, but then also other ecosystems that they built over time and then perhaps sold off again. They have been able to transform themselves in one of the most successful news sites in the world, actually more popular than the Wall Street Journal and I believe even the Financial Times. So in that sense, they actually have been able to transform themselves in a very traditional industry. Having said that, in these traditional industries, the risk is always that the attitudes of managers is not an ecosystem attitude. In the book, we use 8 case studies, but we actually wrote more than that. Peter already referred to the fact that Amazon in its retail business is clearly not an ecosystem. We actually looked at it and came to the conclusion, no, this is not a good example of what an ecosystem in a traditional industry is. We also attempted to write a case study on the Ford Motor Company going into autonomous vehicles. And again, we saw that originally the senior management of Ford Motor Company in 2010 said, we want to develop this autonomous vehicle through an ecosystem. I mean, they actually used the word ecosystem in 2010. But what we then observed for the Ford Motor Company is that very quickly the middle management and maybe senior middle management in this company was so deeply convinced of a traditional supply chain system that they very quickly fell back on their normal traditional way of car development, and they were buying up, acquiring, and controlling and putting in their supply chain some of the companies that they needed to develop autonomous vehicles, which they haven't still done yet 10 years later. Perhaps they should have stuck to that ecosystem approach. But the point I try to make, Jonathan, is that one, ecosystems in traditional industries will help you to react to disruptions, to help you to quickly transform yourself, not to run your daily operations, but that the DNA of these traditional industries, of the managers in these traditional industries, is very often one of control and commands. And so, if you want to move in traditional industries into these ecosystems, you have to be very careful that you actually have the right managers for doing that.
Thank you very much, Arnoud. Peter, smaller companies.
Yes, well, quickly on this, I already mentioned ARM and starting out with 12 engineers, and they had to deal with Apple and Samsung and Taiwan Semiconductor and Texas Instruments. So I think the key is, as they found, you have to know what is the area of the total value system that you're going to try to build your ecosystem in. So don't try and do everything. Don't try and control all these other big players. Think, where do I have something that can gain leverage because the strength of my product or my IP, and engage those other other partners rather than trying to control them if you're a small company, and build your strength in that slice of the value system. And don't worry that other people in the value system are earning more money than you are. I mean, the question that ecosystem leaders need to ask is, am I better off by promoting this ecosystem? Not is what my share of the ecosystem. That doesn't matter. As long as you're better off, the fact that other people are making money is absolutely no problem. So always keeping that in mind is important, I think, if you're a small company, to carve out this area of leverage where you can be an important part of leading this ecosystem in part of the value chain.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. That question of innovation and agility is extremely important. And you mentioned you can't control an ecosystem fully, but it can be leveraged. Is there anything more you'd like to say about those core ideas about an ecosystem and its innovation and agility? You look at various examples, for example. I'd be interested to know what you think about Apple, which is the apparently ultimate controller, but it runs an incredible ecosystem. How do they actually make the most and continue to develop? So could we look at that aspect, please?
Yeah,
on innovation and agility.
We're of course, we're running out of time. I think we're already over time. It turns out it's a big topic, but there are a number of things that you have to do, and I think Apple does some of these things well. And the first is demonstrate that you really believe in the ecosystem and are prepared to invest in it. So when you're starting out, your partners are going to be very skeptical about, this common value and we're all in this together. So you have to really invest by putting some knowledge out there, by creating some sharing with potential partners, and Apple is good at that. It used to be a very closed system. When it started things like the App Store, it had to open up its interfaces with other app developers to actually say, we're really willing to invest something in this in order for it to prosper. And the second thing you have to do is find the right foundation customers, and they're not always the biggest ones. In fact, Arnoud just mentioned in the case of going to the number 2 or 3 company in an industry, because they're the ones that have the most to gain by overturning the status quo. So look for the potential partner that has not only the capabilities you need, but the incentive to change the business model.
Thank you. As you've noted, we are coming to the end of our session, although we can run on for a little while. And I wonder if I could just put one final question to you both, and start perhaps with Arno. Looking forward, what do business leaders need to keep in mind most about their strategy as these new disruptions appear on the horizon? So a little bit of direct advice free to chief executives around the world. Arnoud.
This goes probably beyond ecosystems, but I think that we are moving into a period where business people will be confronted with a higher level of uncertainty. We often use this VUCA concept of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity to describe what the world will look like. But I actually am convinced that there will be more uncertainty coming up in the coming years, partially because a few fundamental trends like globalization, like free trade, etc., are actually challenged today. So I would actually argue that business people will have to develop more agility, concept that exists already since a few years, but will have to develop more agility. And being agile does not come from a very strictly controlled supply chain. So I think there is, for many industries, opportunities to think about how can I use the ecosystem in which I already operate. It's not that I have to develop new ecosystems, but use the ecosystem in which I already operate. How can I provide leadership into it? And how do I design it in such a way that I still can make a fair profit? The monetization of your contribution is actually very important. We describe in the book briefly how one of the very successful ecosystems was probably the combination of IBM, Intel, and Microsoft when they launched personal computers with MS-DOS on it and an Intel processor in the computer. They probably launched one of the most important and well-known ecosystems in the literature that is described in the literature. But we also describe how it actually fell apart in the sense that IBM never made money out of it. So my 2 suggestions would be for people in the industry, be prepared for more uncertainty than what we have today, perhaps more pandemics or crises of this nature, and be therefore very agile. But keep in mind that even within very agile ecosystems, you need to find a way to make some money.
Thank you. Peter, over to you.
Yes, just one message to end off with I'd really like to emphasize, and that is don't try and do everything yourself. The disruption is a really, really challenging environment, and therefore you need to keep focused on what you're good at doing, what you do best, and let your partners do the rest. And there's great danger, I think, if companies try to spread themselves too thinly in responding to disruption. Have in your mind that you need to stay focused and you need to attract partners who already know how to do things in order to get you through this. So I've spent a lot of time, as you mentioned, working with Alibaba, and by the time we finished these interventions, the first question they asked when they had to do something new is, who can help me do this? And that's a big shift away from many companies that say, oh goodness, I've got to deal with this disruption. What do I have to do? Where do I need to invest? The good ecosystem leaders always ask the question, who can I get who's already knows how to do this, already has the capabilities, and bring into the ecosystem to help me respond to the huge challenges associated with coming up with a new business model to deal with disruption.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. And it strikes me actually during the course of this hour or so, we've formed our own little ecosystem, and I think I've had the easiest job. And thank you for all of the insights you've given us. So thank you, Peter and Arnoud. The book is Ecosystem Edge. It's available in bookshops, and it's also, courtesy of Amazon, available on Kindle. I'd also like to just thank Rachel Shand and Charlotte Anderson for all their help behind the scenes in making this happen. And to you, our audience, first of all, thank you for your questions. My apologies if we've not been able to answer all of them, and I know they have flooded in. We will do our best to see if we can get you an answer. But thank you for joining us for this webinar with Arnoud de Meyer in Singapore and Peter Williamson in the UK, authors of Ecosystem Edge, Sustaining Competitiveness in the Face of Disruption. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.